Sometimes the kindest acts lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. When an old cowboy sees a beaten-down horse about to be put out of its misery, his heart won't let him walk away. Amos Rourke has seen better days. His ranch is falling apart, his savings nearly gone, and everyone tells him he's a fool for spending his last dollars on a worn-out horse named Dusty. The other ranchers laugh behind his back, saying he's throwing good money after bad. But Amos has always believed that every creature deserves a chance at dignity. What he doesn't know is that this tired old horse carries secrets from a forgotten war. Strange behaviors begin to surface. Dusty seems to know things no ordinary horse should know. He leads Amos to places that don't appear on any map, responds to commands from a different era, and shows an intelligence that defies explanation. The truth is more incredible than Amos could imagine. What secret was this legendary cavalry horse hiding that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of the livestock auction yard in Clearwater Springs. Dust motes danced in the amber light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, and the familiar symphony of cattle lowing, horses nickering, and men's voices haggling over prices filled the air. It was the kind of scene that had played out in countless western towns for generations, where fortunes were made and lost on the strength of a handshake and the keen eye for good stock. Amos Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. At 67, he carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than most folks had drawing breath. His face was a roadmap of hard-earned wisdom, etched with lines that spoke of long nights under starlit skies, bitter winters that tested a man's resolve, and summers so scorching they could break lesser souls. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, carved out of unforgiving land by his grandfather's steady hands and stubborn will. Amos remembered the stories his father used to tell around the evening fire, tales of cattle drives that stretched for months, of neighbors who rode 30 miles to help with a barn raising, of winters so harsh that survival itself was victory enough. Those were the days when a man's word was his bond, when the land demanded respect and gave back only what was earned through sweat and sacrifice. Now, the ranch showed the wear of too many lean years and too few helping hands. The barn roof leaked in 3 places, the fencing was held together more by hope than wire, and the small herd he maintained barely covered the mounting bills. His wife Martha had passed 5 years ago, taking with her not just companionship, but also the steady income from her teaching position at the local schoolhouse. Their only son, Daniel, had headed east to pursue opportunities in the city, leaving behind well-intentioned promises to visit more often that grew more distant with each passing season. The auctioneer's voice cut through Amos's reverie as he began the livestock portion of the sale. "Now we're moving to the horses, folks. Some good working stock here, and some that might need a little extra attention." The euphemism wasn't lost on anyone present. The horses being brought out now were the ones destined for the slaughterhouse animals deemed too old, too broken, or too difficult to be worth the feed they would consume. Amos watched as a parade of tired horses was led through the ring. Each one told a story of service and decline, of years spent carrying riders across countless miles, pulling plows through stubborn earth, or working cattle under the burning sun. Their heads hung low, their ribs showed through dull coats, and their eyes held the resignation of creatures who sensed their fate. Then Dusty appeared. The horse was led into the ring by Jake Morrison, a livestock dealer known more for his sharp practices than his compassion. Even from a distance, Amos could see that this animal had once been something special. Despite the prominent ribs, the overgrown hooves, and the matted mane, there was something in the way the horse carried himself that spoke of nobility. His coat, though dulled by neglect, showed hints of the rich chestnut color that must have gleamed like polished copper in better days. "This here's a gelding, about 18, maybe 20 years old," Morrison called out, jerking unnecessarily hard on the lead rope. "Been used for ranch work, but he's getting too slow for earning his keep. Starting bid is $50, going straight to processing, if nobody wants him for anything else." The crowd's attention was already moving to other lots. $50 for an old horse heading to slaughter was $50 more than most were willing to spend. Amos found himself studying the animal more closely, noting details that others missed. The horse's legs, though thin, were clean and straight. His back showed no signs of swaying despite his age. Most telling of all were his eyes, dark and intelligent, alert despite the circumstances. Something about those eyes reminded Amos of another horse, one from his childhood. His grandfather's favorite mount had been a chestnut gelding named Thunder, an animal so responsive to his rider's wishes that neighbors swore the two could read each other's minds. Thunder had lived to be 28, spending his final years in comfortable retirement in the home pasture, treated with the respect due a faithful partner. "Going once at $50, the auctioneer called out, his voice already taking on the perfunctory tone reserved for the dregs of the sale. Amos felt something stir in his chest, part memory, part instinct, part simple human decency. He knew what $50 meant to his current financial situation. It represented a week's worth of groceries, or a small repair to the barn roof, or a dozen other necessities that his dwindling resources could barely cover. Martha would have given him one of her looks, the kind that said she loved his generous heart, but worried about his practical sense. Yet as he watched the horse standing quietly in the ring, head held with quiet dignity despite his circumstances, Amos couldn't shake the feeling that some things mattered more than money. His grandfather had always said that the measure of a man wasn't found in what he accumulated, but in what he was willing to sacrifice for what was right. "Going twice, $50, Amos called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Heads turned in his direction, some with surprise, others with barely concealed amusement. He heard Tommy Fletcher, a younger rancher who ran cattle on the land adjacent to the Broken R, mutter something to his companion about old fools and their bleeding hearts. The comment stung more than Amos cared to admit, partly because it echoed his own doubts about the wisdom of his impulse. The auctioneer looked around, hopefully for another bid, but the moment stretched, long and silent. "Sold to Amos Rourke for $50. As Amos made his way to the payment table, he caught fragments of conversation from the other ranchers. The words, "waste of money," "sentimental old fool," and "throwing good money after bad," reached his ears. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, the seeds of doubt began to sprout. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps he was letting his emotions override his judgment. But when he approached the holding area to collect his purchase, those doubts began to fade. The horse, Dusty, as Morrison had called him, looked directly at Amos with those intelligent dark eyes. There was no fear there, no resignation. Instead, Amos saw something that looked remarkably like recognition, as if the animal understood that his circumstances had just changed for the better. "You sure about this, Amos?" Morrison asked, as he handed over the lead rope. "I mean, I appreciate the business, but this old boy's best days are long behind him. Might be kinder to let nature take its course." Amos took the rope gently, noting how the horse immediately relaxed at his touch. "Sometimes the best days aren't behind us at all, Jake. Sometimes they're just waiting to be discovered." The drive back to the Broken R gave Amos time to second-guess his decision at least a dozen times. Dusty rode quietly in the trailer, occasionally nickering softly, as if to reassure his new owner that all was well. The sound was somehow comforting, a reminder that despite the financial strain this purchase represented, he had done something that felt fundamentally right. The ranch looked even more run down than usual as Amos pulled into the yard. The contrast between his diminished circumstances and the leap of faith he had just taken wasn't lost on him. But as he led Dusty out of the trailer and into the old corral, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that change, real change might be possible. The horse immediately began investigating his new surroundings, moving with more energy than his appearance at the auction had suggested. He examined the water trough, tested the hay in the feeder, and surveyed the pasture beyond the corral with obvious interest. For an animal that had seemed destined for the slaughterhouse just hours earlier, he showed remarkable curiosity about his new home. As evening settled over the ranch, Amos stood by the corral fence, watching his new acquisition settle in for the night. The decision still felt risky, maybe even foolish, but it also felt like the first positive step he had taken in a long time. Whatever came next, at least one creature would have a chance at dignity and peace in his final years. 3 days after bringing Dusty home, Amos discovered that his $50 investment might have been the wisest purchase of his life, though not for any reason he could have anticipated. The morning had begun typically enough. Amos rose before dawn, as had been his habit for more years than he cared to count, and made his way to the kitchen for coffee and the simple breakfast that had become his routine since Martha's passing. Through the window above the sink, he could see Dusty standing alert in the corral, head raised toward the eastern horizon, as if waiting for something. The horse had settled in remarkably well, showing none of the confusion or anxiety that typically marked rescued animals. He ate with good appetite, drank regularly, and moved around the corral with increasing confidence. The previous evening, Amos had spent an hour brushing the matted coat, revealing glints of the rich chestnut color that lay beneath the surface neglect. Under the gentle ministrations, Dusty had stood perfectly still, occasionally turning his head to watch Amos work, as if evaluating his new caretaker. After breakfast, Amos headed out to the corral with a bucket of grain and fresh hay. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the first hints of color were beginning to show in the cottonwoods that lined the creek. It was the kind of morning that had always reminded him why he chose to stay on the land, despite the hardships and uncertainties. Dusty greeted him with a low nicker, moving toward the fence with more energy than he had shown at the auction. As Amos approached with the feed bucket, however, the horse did something unexpected. Instead of focusing on the grain, Dusty moved to a specific spot along the fence line and began pawing at the ground with his right forefoot. The action was deliberate, purposeful, unlike the random movements of an animal simply seeking attention. "What's got your interest there, old boy?" Amos murmured, setting down the bucket and moving closer to investigate. The horse continued pawing, creating a small depression in the hard-packed earth near the fence post. When Amos approached, Dusty stepped back slightly but kept his attention fixed on the spot, nickering softly as if trying to communicate something specific. Curiosity overriding his practical morning routine, Amos knelt down and began examining the area more closely. The ground seemed unremarkable at first glance, just the same mixture of clay and sand that characterized most of his property. But as he brushed away the loose dirt that Dusty's pawing had disturbed, his fingers encountered something that didn't belong. It was metal, partially buried and green with age. Working carefully, Amos managed to extract what appeared to be an old military button, tarnished with decades of exposure, but still showing the faint outline of an eagle and the letters U.S. The discovery was intriguing, but not necessarily significant. This part of Colorado had seen its share of military activity during the Indian Wars, and it wasn't uncommon for ranchers to turn up artifacts while working their land. What made the find remarkable was Dusty's behavior. The horse had moved back to the fence and was watching Amos's excavation with obvious interest, occasionally nodding his head as if in approval. When Amos held up the button for inspection, Dusty whinnied softly, a sound that seemed almost like acknowledgement. "How did you know this was here?" Amos asked, studying the horse with new interest. As if in response to the question, Dusty moved along the fence line to another spot, perhaps 20 feet away, and began the same deliberate pawing motion. This time, Amos didn't hesitate to investigate. Within minutes, he had uncovered a second item, a brass buckle, heavily tarnished, but bearing the distinctive crossed sabers insignia of the cavalry. The pattern repeated itself 4 more times over the next hour. Each location Dusty indicated yielded another artifact: a dented harmonica, a broken spur, a brass button from a civilian coat, and finally, most remarkably, a small leather pouch containing 3 silver coins dated 1876. By the time the sun had fully risen, Amos found himself sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the collection of artifacts spread on a piece of canvas before him. The items told a story, though he couldn't yet decipher its full meaning. Military buttons and cavalry insignia suggested soldiers, possibly from the post-Civil War period, when the army was establishing its presence in the Western Territories. The civilian items indicated others had been present as well, perhaps travelers, traders, or settlers. But the most puzzling aspect of the entire morning wasn't the artifacts themselves. It was Dusty's uncanny ability to locate them. The horse had moved with purpose from spot to spot, never hesitating, never pawing randomly. It was as if he possessed some kind of map, some internal knowledge of where these items lay buried. Amos had spent his entire life around horses. He understood their intelligence, their ability to remember trails and landmarks, their sensitivity to their environment. But what Dusty had demonstrated went beyond normal equine behavior. This was something else entirely, a knowledge that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. As he pondered the implications, Amos remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about legendary horses of the Old West. Animals that had carried famous riders, participated in historic events, or demonstrated abilities that bordered on the mystical. Most folks dismissed such tales as frontier folklore, the kind of exaggerated stories that grew in the telling around campfires and saloon bars. But looking at the evidence before him, and at the horse who had revealed it, Amos began to wonder if some of those stories might have been based on truth. The discovery transformed his perspective on the $50 he had spent at the auction. What had seemed like an impulsive act of compassion now felt like destiny, as if some unseen force had guided him to that particular horse at that particular moment. The other ranchers might still consider him a fool for rescuing an old horse, but they hadn't witnessed what he had seen this morning. That evening, as Amos sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey and watched Dusty grazing peacefully in the pasture, he found his mind racing with questions. Where had these artifacts come from? Why were they buried on his property? And most intriguingly, how had Dusty known exactly where to find them? The horse's behavior suggested a connection to the items that went beyond coincidence. It was as if he had been present when they were buried, as if he remembered the exact locations from some previous time. But that would mean Dusty was far older than his appearance suggested, older than any horse could reasonably be expected to live. As impossible as it seemed, Amos couldn't shake the feeling that his $50 purchase had brought him more than just a rescued animal. He had acquired a living piece of history, a keeper of secrets that might hold the key to mysteries he was only beginning to understand. The artifacts lay carefully arranged on his kitchen table, each one a tangible link to a past that suddenly seemed less distant than it had that morning. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin researching their origins. But tonight, he would sit with his whiskey and contemplate the remarkable turn his life had taken, thanks to an old horse who apparently knew more about his property than he did. The next morning brought a visitor that Amos hadn't expected and wasn't sure he wanted. Tommy Fletcher's pickup truck rumbled into the yard just after sunrise, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over everything like a reminder of how dry the season had been. Tommy was a good neighbor. In the traditional sense, he'd help with a barn raising or lend a hand during calving season, but he also had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. "Morning, Amos," Tommy called out as he climbed down from his truck. At 35, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had inherited good land and made it better, someone who measured success in head of cattle and acres under cultivation. His ranch, the Double Bar F, sprawled across some of the best grazing land in the valley, and Tommy never let anyone forget it. Tommy. Amos nodded, setting down the coffee cup he had been nursing on the porch. "What brings you out this early?" "Heard you made an interesting purchase at the auction yesterday," Tommy said, his gaze moving toward the corral where Dusty stood, watching the conversation with alert interest. "Folks are talking." Amos felt his jaw tighten slightly. In small ranching communities, news traveled faster than wildfire, and it was usually about as welcome when it concerned your personal business. Folks always find something to talk about. Tommy walked over to the corral fence and studied Dusty with the critical eye of someone who had been evaluating livestock since he could walk. The horse returned his gaze steadily, showing neither fear nor submission. If anything, Dusty seemed to be conducting his own assessment of the visitor. "He's in worse shape than I heard," Tommy observed. "Ribs showing, coat's dull. Looks like he hasn't had proper care in months. You sure you didn't just throw $50 away?" "Time will tell," Amos replied evenly, though something in his tone must have warned Tommy to tread carefully. "Look, I'm not trying to give you grief," Tommy continued, apparently missing the warning. "It's just that word gets around when one of our neighbors makes a purchase that doesn't make much business sense. People start wondering if maybe it's time to think about retiring, maybe consider selling to someone who could put the land to better use." The words hit Amos like a physical blow. He had suspected that some of the younger ranchers viewed his operation as a relic of the past, but he hadn't realized the sentiment had crystallized into actual conversations about his future. The idea that his moment of compassion at the auction might be seen as evidence of declining judgment was both insulting and alarming. "My land isn't for sale," Amos said quietly, but with finality that left no room for argument. "I'm just saying, if you ever change your mind, I know some folks who might be interested in making a fair offer. Good land shouldn't go to waste." After Tommy left, Amos found himself standing alone in the yard, feeling older than his 67 years. The implication had been clear enough. The other ranchers saw him as a failing operation, a man whose best days were behind him. The purchase of Dusty hadn't been seen as an act of kindness. It had been viewed as evidence of poor judgment, another sign that he was losing his grip on reality. The conversation troubled him more than he cared to admit, partly because it echoed his own doubts about the decision. $50 was significant money for him right now, and he had spent it on an old horse with no practical value. From a purely business standpoint, Tommy and the others were probably right. But as he walked back toward the corral, Dusty approached the fence and extended his nose toward Amos's outstretched hand. The gesture was gentle, almost consoling, as if the horse somehow understood his owner's troubled thoughts. The touch was warm and reassuring, a reminder that some decisions couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "What do you think, old boy?" Amos murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "Are they right? Am I just a foolish old man who doesn't know when to quit?" Dusty's response was to move toward the same spot where he had found the first military button the previous day. But instead of pawing at the ground, he simply stood there, head lowered, as if paying respects at a grave. The posture was so deliberate, so human in its solemnity, that Amos felt a chill run down his spine. That afternoon, Amos drove into town with the artifacts carefully wrapped in an old towel on the passenger seat of his truck. Clearwater Springs wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, but it boasted a library housed in a converted railroad depot and staffed by Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a retired schoolteacher who had made local history her personal mission. Eleanor examined the artifacts with the reverence of someone handling religious relics. She was a small, precise woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck. Her knowledge of local history was encyclopedic, accumulated over decades of collecting stories, documents, and artifacts from the area's pioneer days. "These are definitely military," she confirmed, studying the buttons and buckle through a magnifying glass. "The style dates them to the 1870s, probably the Indian Wars period. We had several cavalry units pass through this area during that time." "Any particular unit you can identify?" Amos asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Eleanor picked up the buckle and examined it more closely. The crossed sabers indicate cavalry, but without additional markings, it's difficult to be certain. However, she paused, setting down the magnifying glass and moving to a filing cabinet that dominated one corner of the small library. There is one possibility that comes to mind. She returned with a manila folder thick with documents and newspaper clippings. Have you ever heard of Captain Marcus Thornfield? Amos shook his head, though the name stirred something in his memory, like the echo of an old story half remembered. Thornfield commanded a cavalry detachment that was stationed briefly in this area in 1876, Eleanor explained, spreading out photocopied documents on the table between them. They were part of the campaign against the Northern Cheyenne, but Thornfield's unit was involved in something else as well, something that never made it into the official records. She showed him a faded newspaper clipping from the Denver Post, dated October 15, 1876. The headline read, "Cavalry Unit Missing After Patrol, Gold Shipment Unaccounted For." According to this article, Thornfield and 12 men were escorting a gold shipment from the mining camps to the railroad depot in Colorado Springs. They never arrived. The unit was found 3 weeks later, or what was left of them. Most had died in what appeared to be an Indian attack, but Thornfield and 2 others were never found. Neither was the gold. Amos studied the article, his pulse quickening as he read the details. The attack had occurred approximately 15 miles southeast of Clearwater Springs, in an area that would now be part of his ranch. The official report blamed Cheyenne raiders, but there had always been rumors that the story was more complicated than it appeared. There were whispers, Eleanor continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. Some said Thornfield had been in communication with the Cheyenne, that he was trying to broker a peace agreement. Others claimed he had discovered evidence of corruption in the territorial government and was planning to expose it. The gold shipment was supposed to be payment for a land deal, but if the deal was fraudulent, she shrugged, leaving the implication hanging in the air. What happened to Captain Thornfield? Amos asked. Nobody knows for certain. He simply vanished. Some believed he was killed with his men, but his body was never recovered. Others thought he might have escaped, either wounded or captured. There were occasional sightings over the years, a man matching his description seen in various frontier towns, but nothing was ever confirmed. Eleanor returned the documents to the folder, then studied Amos with curious eyes. May I ask where you found these artifacts? Amos hesitated, unsure how much he wanted to reveal. The story of Dusty's uncanny ability to locate buried objects would sound fantastical at best, delusional at worst. On my property, I was doing some fence repair and turned them up with a shovel. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it omitted the most remarkable part of the truth. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Your land would have been right in the area where Thornfield's unit was ambushed. It's entirely possible that some of the missing soldiers made it that far before. She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. As Amos drove home, his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. The artifacts weren't random relics, they were connected to a specific historical event, a mystery that had remained unsolved for nearly 150 years. And somehow, impossibly, Dusty had known exactly where to find them. The horse was waiting at the corral fence when Amos pulled into the yard, as if he had been anticipating his owner's return. In the fading light of evening, with his newly brushed coat gleaming and his head held high, Dusty looked less like a rescue animal and more like the magnificent creature he must have been in his prime. "What do you know about Captain Thornfield?" Amos asked quietly, approaching the fence. Dusty's ears pricked forward at the name, and for a moment Amos could have sworn he saw recognition in those intelligent dark eyes. The revelation about Captain Thornfield haunted Amos through a restless night. He found himself lying in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each new piece of information. By the time dawn broke, he had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He was going to saddle Dusty and see what other secrets the horse might reveal. The old tack room hadn't been used much since Martha's passing. She had been the rider in the family during their later years, taking her mare out on gentle trail rides through the foothills, while Amos focused on the practical demands of running cattle. Now, as he searched through the dust-covered equipment, he found a saddle that might fit Dusty's back and a bridle that appeared to be in reasonable condition. Dusty accepted the tack with the patience of a horse long accustomed to being saddled, standing perfectly still while Amos worked. There was something almost ceremonial in the way the horse positioned himself, as if he understood the significance of this moment. When Amos tightened the cinch, Dusty turned his head briefly to watch, then faced forward again with an air of readiness that was unmistakable. Mounting was more challenging than Amos had anticipated. His knees protested the movement, and his balance wasn't what it had been in younger years. But once he settled into the saddle, muscle memory took over. The feeling of being horseback again, after months of ground-bound work, was like stepping back into a familiar room after a long absence. Dusty stood quietly, waiting for direction. Amos gathered the reins and applied gentle pressure with his legs, expecting the horse to move forward tentatively, perhaps showing the stiffness and uncertainty that might be expected from an animal that had been neglected for so long. Instead, Dusty stepped off, with the fluid grace of a horse in his prime. His gait was smooth and confident, his response to Amos's cues immediate and precise. Within moments, they were moving across the pasture at an easy walk that felt as natural as breathing. "Well, I'll be," Amos murmured, marveling at the transformation. The broken-down auction horse had disappeared, replaced by an animal that moved with purpose and dignity. It was as if the simple act of being under saddle had awakened something in Dusty, restored him to his true nature. They rode toward the eastern boundary of the ranch, where the land rose into gentle hills covered with scrub, oak, and juniper. Amos had intended to guide their route, but as they moved away from the buildings, he found himself simply following Dusty's choices. The horse seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go. The path Dusty chose led them up a rocky draw that Amos had explored countless times over the years. It was good country for hunting deer and elk, with hidden springs that attracted wildlife and vantage points that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain. But today, Dusty bypassed all the familiar landmarks, following instead what appeared to be an ancient game trail that wound deeper into the hills. After an hour of steady climbing, they emerged onto a broad mesa that Amos had never seen before, despite having lived on this land for decades. The discovery was unsettling. How could there be parts of his own property that remained unknown to him? But as he looked around, he realized that the mesa was positioned in such a way that it was invisible from below, hidden by the configuration of surrounding ridges. Dusty moved to the center of the mesa and stopped, his attention focused on a particular spot where the grass grew shorter and the underlying rock was visible in patches. Amos dismounted and found himself standing in what appeared to be the remains of an old campsite. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent his life reading the land. Depressions where tents had been pitched, a ring of stones that had once contained cooking fires, areas where the grass grew differently because the soil beneath had been disturbed. But it was more than just an old campsite. As Amos walked the perimeter, he began to recognize the layout of a military encampment. The positioning of the tent sites, the location of the fire rings, the clear sight lines in all directions, everything suggested this had been a cavalry camp, temporary but well organized. Dusty had moved to the eastern edge of the mesa and was standing with his head raised, looking out over the valley below. When Amos joined him, he could see why this location had been chosen. The view commanded the entire approach from the east, the direction from which any threat would most likely come. It was a perfect defensive position, but also an excellent place to watch for signals or movements in the distance. "This is where Thornfield's unit was camped," Amos said aloud, though he was speaking more to himself than to the horse. "Before the ambush, before everything went wrong." Dusty's ears flicked back at the mention of Thornfield's name, and he began moving again, this time toward the southern edge of the mesa. Here, a narrow trail led down into a canyon that Amos had never explored. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse, and it wound between rock formations that created natural blind spots and ambush points. As they descended, Amos began to understand the tactical situation that Thornfield had faced. The mesa was an excellent observation post, but it was also a trap. There was only one practical way up and down, and an enemy force could easily bottle up anyone camping above. If Thornfield had been betrayed, if someone had revealed the location of his camp, his unit would have found themselves in an impossible position. The canyon opened onto a wider valley, and here Dusty's behavior changed dramatically. The horse began showing signs of distress, dancing sideways, tossing his head, and generally acting as if he were experiencing painful memories. Amos had seen similar behavior in horses that had been traumatized, animals that would become agitated when returning to a place where something terrible had happened. "Easy, boy," Amos said softly, leaning forward to stroke the horse's neck. "It's all right. Whatever happened here, it's long over." But even as he spoke the words, Amos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The valley felt wrong somehow, heavy with the weight of old violence. Scattered among the rocks were what looked like bleached bones, too old and weathered to identify with certainty, but suggestive nonetheless. Dusty moved carefully through the valley, picking his way around certain areas, as if avoiding invisible obstacles. His route seemed random at first, but gradually Amos began to see the pattern. The horse was following what might have been a retreat route, the path that survivors might have taken while trying to escape an overwhelming attack. The trail led to a narrow cleft in the western wall of the valley, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Dusty approached the opening with obvious reluctance, stopping several times as if fighting an internal battle between memory and instinct. The cleft was just wide enough for a horse and rider, carved by centuries of water erosion into a natural corridor through solid rock. As they entered the passage, Amos felt the temperature drop noticeably. The walls rose high above them, blocking out most of the sky and creating an atmosphere of isolation that was both protective and ominous. Halfway through the passage, Dusty stopped completely and refused to move forward. His ears were laid back, his muscles tense with anxiety, and despite Amos's gentle encouragement, he would not take another step. Something about this place had triggered memories too powerful to overcome. Amos dismounted and examined the ground more carefully. Here, sheltered from the elements by the overhanging rock walls, the evidence of the past was better preserved. He found more bones, definitely human this time, along with scraps of military equipment that had somehow survived the decades. A rusted saber blade, broken off at the hilt. Brass buttons green with corrosion, fragments of leather that might have been part of a saddle or harness. The story was becoming clearer. Thornfield's unit had been ambushed in the valley, and the survivors had tried to escape through this narrow passage. Some had made it this far before being overwhelmed by their pursuers. Others had perhaps died from their wounds, unable to continue the desperate retreat. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. At the narrowest point of the passage, where the rock walls almost touched overhead, Amos found something that made his heart race with excitement and dread. Carved into the stone, barely visible after nearly 150 years of weathering, were the letters M.T., and below them, 1,876. Marcus Thornfield had been here. The missing cavalry captain had made it this far in his flight from the ambush, long enough to leave his mark on the stone. Whether he had survived beyond this point was still unknown, but at least now there was proof that he had escaped the initial attack. Dusty had calmed somewhat during Amos's investigation, but he remained reluctant to proceed further into the passage. Respecting the horse's instincts, Amos remounted and they retreated back to the valley, taking a different route home that avoided the most emotionally charged areas. The ride back to the ranch was contemplative, both man and horse lost in their own thoughts. Amos found himself grappling with the implications of what they had discovered. The evidence was mounting that Dusty possessed knowledge that no ordinary horse could have. The alternative explanations, coincidence, luck, or keen animal instincts were becoming harder to accept with each new revelation. As they approached the ranch buildings in the gathering dusk, Amos made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Tomorrow, he would return to the passage and explore what lay beyond. If Marcus Thornfield had survived long enough to carve his initials in the stone, there might be more evidence of what had happened to him. And if the rumors were true about a missing gold shipment, there might be something even more significant waiting to be discovered. But tonight, as he unsaddled Dusty and watched the horse roll contentedly in the dust of the corral, Amos allowed himself to marvel at the extraordinary turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a struggling rancher, facing the possibility of losing his land. Now, he was the custodian of historical mysteries that could rewrite the known history of the region. The transformation wasn't lost on him. In trying to save an old horse, he had perhaps saved himself as well, finding purpose and adventure at a time when both had seemed forever beyond his reach. Whatever came next, Amos knew that his life would never be the same. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would complicate Amos's plans considerably. Dr. Sarah Chen pulled into the yard in a dust-covered Jeep Cherokee, followed by a second vehicle carrying 2 graduate students and what appeared to be a substantial amount of equipment. Amos watched from the porch as the small convoy parked near the corral, wondering what could possibly bring university people to his remote corner of the world. Dr. Chen emerged from the lead vehicle with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of extensive field work. Her clothing was functional rather than fashionable: hiking boots, canvas pants, and a field jacket with multiple pockets that bulged with various tools and instruments. "Mr. Rourke," she called out as she approached the porch. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Colorado's Department of Archaeology. I wonder if we could have a word." Amos set down his coffee cup and studied the woman with growing unease. The timing of her arrival, so soon after his discovery of the artifacts, seemed more than coincidental. "What can I do for you, Dr. Chen? I understand you may have found some historical artifacts on your property," she said without preamble. "Military items from the 1870s, possibly related to Captain Marcus Thornfield's missing cavalry unit." The directness of her statement caught Amos off guard. He had shared the details of his discovery only with Eleanor Whitman at the library, and he had trusted her discretion. Apparently, that trust had been misplaced. "Eleanor called me yesterday evening," Dr. Chen continued, as if reading his thoughts. "She was excited about your finds and thought they might be of interest to our department. We've been researching the Thornfield incident for several years, and any new evidence could be extremely valuable." Amos felt a surge of irritation at Eleanor's presumption, but he kept his voice level. "I found a few old buttons and such. Nothing that would interest university folks, I wouldn't think." Dr. Chen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Rourke, I've been studying frontier military history for 15 years. The Thornfield case represents one of the most significant unsolved mysteries of the Indian Wars period. If you've found artifacts that can be definitively linked to his unit, they could provide crucial insights into what really happened during that ambush." She gestured toward her companions, who were now unloading equipment from their vehicle. "We'd like permission to conduct a preliminary survey of your property using ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment." Any significant finds would remain your property, of course, but we'd ask for the opportunity to study them and publish our findings. The request was reasonable on the surface, but Amos found himself reluctant to agree. The idea of strangers tramping across his land with sophisticated equipment, potentially uncovering secrets that he was only beginning to understand himself, didn't sit well with him. More importantly, he wasn't sure how Dusty would react to the presence of so many unfamiliar people, especially given the horse's obvious emotional connection to the historical events they were investigating. "I appreciate your interest, Dr. Chen, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of disruption right now," Amos said carefully. "Maybe we could start smaller. Perhaps you could examine the items I've already found and see if they're really as significant as you think they might be." Dr. Chen's expression tightened slightly, the look of someone accustomed to getting her way but encountering unexpected resistance. "Of course, we'd be happy to authenticate your artifacts, but you have to understand, Mr. Rourke, time is a factor here. If word gets out about potential Thornfield-related discoveries, you might find yourself dealing with treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists who won't be nearly as respectful of your property rights." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Cooperate with us, or deal with people who might not ask permission." "Let me think about it," Amos said, rising from his chair with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. "I'll get back to you." After the academics departed, somewhat reluctantly, Amos found himself pacing the porch and wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, Dr. Chen's expertise could help him understand the significance of what he had found. On the other hand, turning his property into an archaeological dig site would fundamentally change his relationship with the land and the mysteries it contained. Dusty seemed to share his unease. The horse had remained at the far end of the corral during the visitor's stay, watching the proceedings with obvious suspicion. Now, as Amos approached the fence, Dusty moved closer and nuzzled his shoulder in what felt like a gesture of support. "What do you think, old boy?" Amos murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "Can we trust them with our secrets?" Dusty's response was to move toward the gate of the corral, clearly indicating his desire to go out. Amos understood the message. There was more to discover before outsiders were brought into the picture. Within an hour, they were back on the trail toward the hidden mesa. This time, however, Amos had come better prepared. His saddlebags contained a digital camera, a concession to modern technology that Martha had insisted upon years earlier, a small hand shovel, and canvas bags for collecting any artifacts they might find. The ride to the mesa passed without incident, and Dusty once again demonstrated his uncanny knowledge of the terrain by taking a more direct route than they had followed the previous day. When they reached the old cavalry campsite, however, the horse's behavior was different. Instead of moving immediately toward the canyon that led to the ambush site, Dusty began investigating the camp area itself more thoroughly. His attention was focused on a section of the mesa where the grass grew in an unusually regular pattern, as if something beneath the surface was affecting its growth. When Amos dismounted to investigate, he discovered what appeared to be the outline of a large rectangular depression, barely visible but detectable if you knew what to look for. Using the small shovel, Amos began carefully excavating the area. Within minutes, he had uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a wooden crate, preserved by the dry mountain air and protected by decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. The discovery sent his pulse racing. This wasn't just another random artifact, it was something substantial, something that had been deliberately buried and concealed. Working with growing excitement, Amos gradually exposed more of the crate, revealing military markings and stenciled letters that were still partially legible. The words U.S. Army were clearly visible, along with numbers that appeared to be inventory codes. But it was the additional marking, stenciled in smaller letters below the official designation, that made Amos's hands tremble as he brushed away the dirt. Payroll, capped. M. Thornfield. He sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery with a mixture of elation and trepidation. If this crate contained what the markings suggested, he had just uncovered evidence that could solve one of the great mysteries of the frontier period. But he had also potentially found something that other people might be willing to kill for. The gold shipment that had disappeared with Thornfield's unit had been worth a fortune in 1,876. In today's terms, adjusted for inflation and the current price of gold, it would be worth millions. The implications were staggering, and suddenly Dr. Chen's urgency about securing the site took on a more ominous significance. Dusty had moved to a position where he could watch the approaches to the mesa, his alertness suggesting that he understood the importance of maintaining secrecy. The horse's behavior reinforced Amos's growing certainty that they were being watched, that news of the initial discoveries had already spread beyond the academic community. As Amos carefully reburied the crate, marking its location for future reference but concealing it from casual observation, he found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could contact Dr. Chen and turn the site over to official excavation, ensuring that the discoveries would be handled professionally, but losing control over the process and potentially the profits. Or he could continue investigating on his own, with Dusty's help, and try to uncover the full truth about what had happened to Captain Thornfield and his missing gold shipment. The choice was dangerous. If the wrong people learned about the buried payroll, Amos could find himself in serious trouble. But it was also potentially the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to solve a historical mystery and secure his financial future in one extraordinary discovery. That evening, Amos sat at his kitchen table with the original artifacts spread before him, studying them under the harsh glare of the overhead light. The military buttons, the cavalry buckle, the tarnished harmonica, each piece told part of a story that was becoming more complex and dangerous with every revelation. The discovery of the buried payroll crate had transformed what had seemed like an interesting historical puzzle into something that could attract the wrong kind of attention. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Through the window, he could see headlights turning into his driveway, moving slowly and deliberately. It was past 9 o'clock, well beyond the time when neighbors would make casual social calls. Amos quickly gathered the artifacts and placed them in a drawer, then moved to the window for a better view. The vehicle was a black SUV with tinted windows, the kind that suggested either government business or people who preferred to conduct their affairs away from public scrutiny. It parked near the porch, and Amos watched as two men emerged. Even in the darkness, their bearing and movements suggested military or law enforcement background, too straight, too alert, too conscious of their surroundings. The knock on the door was firm but not aggressive. When Amos opened it, he found himself facing two men in their 30s, both wearing casual clothing that somehow managed to look like uniforms. The taller of the two, a lean man with close-cropped hair and pale eyes, spoke first. "Mr. Rourke, my name is Agent Morrison, and this is Agent Rodriguez. We're with the Bureau of Land Management's Cultural Resources Division. We understand you may have made some archaeological discoveries on your property. The identification they showed appeared authentic, but something about their presence felt wrong to Amos. The BLM had jurisdiction over public lands, not private property, and their interest in his discoveries seemed premature, given that he had shared details with only a few people. "I'm not sure what you've heard," Amos said carefully, "but I haven't made any claims about archaeological discoveries. Found a few old buttons while doing fence work. That's all." Agent Rodriguez, a stockier man with intelligent dark eyes, smiled in a way that didn't reach his face. "Mr. Rourke, we know you've been in contact with Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Colorado. We also know that you've made multiple trips to areas of your property that correspond to historical sites of federal interest. We'd like to discuss the possibility of cooperative investigation." The level of detail they possessed was alarming. If they knew about his rides with Dusty and his visits to the mesa, they had been conducting surveillance of his property. The realization sent a chill down Amos's spine. How long had they been watching? And what else did they know? "This is private property," Amos said, allowing some steel to enter his voice. "I don't believe the BLM has authority here without a warrant." "You're absolutely right," Morrison agreed smoothly. "We're not here in an enforcement capacity. We're hoping for voluntary cooperation. The sites you've been visiting have potential significance for our understanding of military operations during the Indian Wars. If artifacts or remains are present, they need to be handled according to federal guidelines." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with the agents alternating between veiled threats and offers of cooperation. They made it clear that they were aware of his financial situation and suggested that official recognition of archaeological significance on his property could lead to federal grants and tourism revenue. They also made it equally clear that attempting to exploit such discoveries privately could result in serious legal consequences. After they left, Amos found himself shaken by the encounter. The arrival of federal agents, so soon after Dr. Chen's visit, suggested that his discoveries had attracted attention at levels he hadn't anticipated. The story about the BLM's Cultural Resources Division was plausible, but something about the agent's manner and knowledge suggested a different kind of government interest. He spent a restless night considering his options, all of which seemed fraught with risk. By morning, he had reached a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He would continue his investigation, but more carefully and with better preparation for the dangers that lay ahead. The first step was to understand exactly what he was dealing with. After breakfast, Amos drove back to the library in Clearwater Springs, where Eleanor Whitman greeted him with obvious excitement. "Amos, I heard from Dr. Chen that you're going to cooperate with the university survey. How wonderful. This could put Clearwater Springs on the historical map." "Actually, Eleanor, I haven't made any commitments yet," Amos said, noting how quickly news traveled in small communities. "But I do need to learn more about what might be out there. Do you have any information about the gold shipment that disappeared with Thornfield's unit?" Eleanor's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a researcher presented with her favorite subject. "Oh my, yes. That's one of the most intriguing aspects of the whole story." She moved to her filing cabinet and withdrew a different folder, this one even thicker than the first. "The official records are frustratingly vague," she explained, spreading documents across the table. The shipment was described as payroll and operational funds, but the amount was never specified. "However, I've found some interesting correspondence in the territorial governor's papers that suggests it was much more than routine military pay." She showed him a letter dated September 1876, written by Governor Edward McCook to the Secretary of War. The language was formal and circumspect, but it clearly referred to a significant financial loss and concerns about maintaining territorial stability in the wake of Thornfield's disappearance. Reading between the lines, Eleanor continued, "It appears that the gold was intended as payment for a major land acquisition, possibly the purchase of mineral rights from local tribes or the funding of a railroad construction project. The amount involved would have been substantial, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1876 currency." Amos did quick mental calculations. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1876 gold would be worth several $1 million today, possibly more depending on the current precious metals market. The stakes were enormous, large enough to explain the sudden interest from federal agents and university researchers. "There's something else," Eleanor said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I've been doing some research since you brought me those artifacts yesterday. Captain Thornfield wasn't just any cavalry officer. He was the son of a prominent Boston banking family, and he had connections to some very powerful people in Washington. His disappearance caused quite a stir at the highest levels of government." She showed him a newspaper clipping from the Washington Post, dated November 1876, with the headline, "Senator Demands Investigation into Missing Cavalry Officer." The article mentioned Thornfield's family connections and suggested that his disappearance might have been connected to territorial corruption rather than Indian raids. There were rumors, Eleanor continued, that Thornfield had discovered evidence of fraud in territorial land dealings. Some people believed he was killed not by Indians, but by men who wanted to prevent him from exposing their crimes. If that's true, then the missing gold might have been hidden rather than stolen. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture that was both clearer and more complex than Amos had imagined. Thornfield hadn't been just another cavalry officer killed in an Indian raid. He had been a threat to powerful interests, and his disappearance had been part of a larger conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. As Amos drove home, he found himself looking in his rear-view mirror more often than usual, checking for signs of surveillance. The black SUV was nowhere to be seen, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The discovery of the payroll crate had changed everything, transforming him from a curious rancher into a potential target for people who would stop at nothing to claim the lost treasure. Back at the ranch, Dusty was waiting at the corral fence, his attention focused on the eastern hills, as if he were watching for something. When Amos approached, the horse moved restlessly, pawing the ground and nickering softly. His agitation was obvious, and it matched Amos's own growing sense that events were moving beyond his control. That evening, as he sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Amos made his final decision. Tomorrow, he and Dusty would return to the mesa one more time. If the payroll crate contained what he suspected, he would have to decide whether to reveal its location or find a way to claim it himself. Either choice would change his life forever, but doing nothing was no longer an option. The dawn air was crisp with the promise of winter as Amos saddled Dusty for what he suspected might be their most important ride together. The horse seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing perfectly still while Amos secured the saddlebags that now contained additional tools, a proper spade, heavy-duty canvas bags, and even a small crowbar he had found in the barn. As they rode toward the mesa, Amos found himself studying Dusty with new awareness. The horse's knowledge of the terrain, his emotional reactions to specific locations, his uncanny ability to locate buried artifacts, all of it pointed to a connection with the historical events that went far beyond coincidence or animal instinct. But the full implications of that connection were about to become clear in a way that would shake Amos's understanding of reality itself. The hidden mesa was empty and peaceful in the morning light, showing no signs that federal agents or university researchers had found it during the night. Dusty moved immediately to the location where they had discovered the buried crate, but his behavior was different today. Instead of the focused purposefulness he had shown previously, the horse seemed hesitant, almost reluctant to approach the site. Amos dismounted and began the careful process of excavating the payroll crate. The work was harder than he had anticipated. The container was larger than his initial probing had suggested, and it was buried deeper than he had realized. As he dug, sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. After nearly an hour of steady work, Amos had exposed enough of the crate to attempt opening it. The wood was solid but weathered, and the metal clasps were corroded with age. Using the crowbar as a lever, he managed to force open the lid with a creaking protest that echoed across the silent mesa. The contents took his breath away. The crate was filled with leather pouches, each one heavy with gold coins. But these weren't just the standard military payroll he had expected to find. Mixed among the pouches were items that seemed far more valuable and significant: ornate jewelry, silver artifacts that appeared to be of Native American origin, and documents wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from moisture. With trembling hands, Amos extracted one of the document bundles and carefully unwrapped it. The papers inside were a mixture of official military correspondence, personal letters, and what appeared to be legal documents. As he began reading, the true scope of Captain Thornfield's mission became clear. The gold hadn't been simple payroll money. It had been payment for a treaty negotiation, an attempt to purchase mineral rights to land that contained significant silver and copper deposits. But the treaty had been fraudulent from the beginning, designed to cheat the local tribes out of valuable resources while enriching territorial officials and their business partners. Captain Thornfield had discovered the fraud and was planning to expose it when he and his unit were ambushed. But the ambush hadn't been the work of hostile Indians. It had been carried out by men hired by the very officials Thornfield was preparing to accuse. One letter, written in Thornfield's own hand and dated just days before his disappearance, laid out the entire conspiracy in detail. Names, amounts, dates, everything needed to expose the corruption that had reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The letter was addressed to Senator Charles Sumner in Washington, a known advocate for honest dealings with Native American tribes. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Amos continued reading through the documents, he found a detailed account of the ambush itself, written in a different hand but signed by Captain Thornfield. The document described how the attack had been carried out by a group of gunmen disguised as Indians, how most of his men had been killed in the initial assault, and how he and 2 survivors had managed to escape with the evidence and the gold. The account went on to describe their flight through the mountains, the death of one companion from his wounds, and finally, Thornfield's decision to hide the treasure and evidence rather than risk them falling into the wrong hands. He had planned to return for them once he had safely delivered his report to authorities in Washington, but Marcus Thornfield had never made it to Washington. According to his own account, he had been mortally wounded during the final escape attempt and had only enough strength left to hide the crate and write this final testament before succumbing to his injuries. The implications hit Amos like a physical blow. If Thornfield had died here on the mesa, his body might still be buried somewhere nearby. But more importantly, the captain's final written words contained information that could still expose the descendants and successors of the men who had murdered him and his soldiers. As Amos sat back on his heels, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered, Dusty moved closer and nudged his shoulder with obvious urgency. The horse was staring intently toward the eastern edge of the mesa, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. Following Dusty's gaze, Amos saw what had captured the horse's attention. A dust cloud was rising from the valley below, indicating approaching riders. From the size of the cloud, there were several of them, and they were moving at considerable speed directly toward the hidden mesa. Amos's mind raced as he considered his options. The approaching riders could be the federal agents, Dr. Chen's archaeological team, or someone else entirely. Regardless of their identity, he wasn't ready to share his discovery with anyone until he had time to fully understand its implications and decide on the best course of action. Working with desperate efficiency, Amos rewrapped the most important documents and stuffed them into his saddlebags. He selected several of the heaviest gold pouches and added them to his gear, then carefully reburied the rest of the crate's contents. The job wasn't perfect, but it would conceal the treasure from casual observation. As he worked, however, Dusty's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. The horse was now moving in tight circles, tossing his head and whinnying softly. His distress seemed out of proportion to the approaching riders, suggesting that something else was troubling him. It was then that Amos made the connection that would change everything he thought he knew about his companion. Dusty's knowledge of the terrain, his emotional reactions to the historical sites, his ability to locate buried artifacts, all of it could be explained if the horse had been present during the original events. Not as a descendant or a somehow mystically connected animal, but as an actual witness to Captain Thornfield's final days. The realization was impossible to accept rationally, but it explained everything that had puzzled Amos about the horse's behavior. Dusty hadn't simply inherited knowledge or instincts. He had been there when Thornfield's unit was ambushed, when the survivors fled through the mountains, when the treasure was buried on the mesa. But that would mean Dusty was nearly 150 years old, an impossibility that challenged every assumption about the natural world. Yet as Amos looked into the horse's intelligent dark eyes, he saw not just awareness but recognition, the look of a creature who had been waiting a very long time for someone to understand the truth he carried. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his revelation. The riders were closer now, and from their positioning and movement, they were clearly converging on the mesa from multiple directions. This wasn't a casual visit or an academic expedition. It was a coordinated operation, designed to prevent escape. "Time to go, old friend," Amos whispered, swinging into the saddle with more haste than grace. Dusty needed no encouragement. The horse sprang into motion with a vitality that belied his apparent age, carrying Amos toward the narrow trail that led down from the mesa. But as they reached the edge of the escarpment, Amos could see riders emerging from the canyon below, cutting off their primary escape route. They were trapped on the mesa, with armed men closing in from all sides. The lost treasure of Captain Thornfield had finally been found, but Amos was beginning to understand that some secrets were buried for very good reasons, and that disturbing them could have deadly consequences. Dusty stood at the edge of the mesa, his sides heaving from the urgent ascent, but his attention was focused entirely on the approaching riders below. Amos counted at least 6 men, all mounted on fresh horses and moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. They had positioned themselves to block every obvious escape route, demonstrating a knowledge of the terrain that suggested careful reconnaissance. "Easy, boy," Amos murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to calm the horse or himself. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his grip on the reins, the weight of the gold and documents in his saddlebags, a constant reminder of the stakes involved. The closest rider was now near enough for Amos to make out details. The man wore civilian clothing, but his bearing and equipment suggested military or law enforcement background. More troubling was the rifle he carried across his saddle, a modern weapon that looked distinctly out of place in what should have been an academic or regulatory investigation. Dusty backed away from the edge of the mesa, but instead of showing fear or panic, the horse seemed to be thinking, evaluating their options with the kind of tactical awareness that Amos had never seen in an animal before. The realization that his companion might indeed be the same horse that had carried Captain Thornfield through these mountains nearly 150 years ago no longer seemed impossible. It was the only explanation that made sense of everything they had experienced together. "You remember this, don't you?" Amos said quietly. "You've been trapped up here before." Dusty's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, then forward again, as the horse moved toward what appeared to be a dead end, the western face of the mesa, where sheer rock walls dropped into a canyon that looked impossibly deep and narrow. But as they approached the edge, Amos could see that the cliff face wasn't as smooth as it appeared from a distance. Erosion and geological activity had created a series of ledges and crevices that might, with great care and considerable luck, provide a way down. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was getting closer. The riders had reached the base of the mesa and were beginning to ascend the main trail. Amos estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before the first men reached the top, and once that happened, their options would be reduced to surrender or a fight they couldn't win. Dusty moved to a specific point along the western edge, a place where the cliff face was broken by what might have been a rock slide or ancient water damage. The horse peered over the edge, then looked back at Amos with an expression that seemed to ask if he was ready to trust his life to a path that had been used successfully once before, under similar desperate circumstances. "This is how Thornfield got away, isn't it?" Amos said, studying the treacherous descent. "This is the route you took with him." The horse's response was to begin the descent, picking his way carefully among the loose rocks and narrow ledges with the confidence of someone who had traveled this path before. Amos leaned back in the saddle and tried to remember everything his grandfather had taught him about riding in difficult terrain. Trust your horse, keep your weight centered, and don't look down unless absolutely necessary. The descent was terrifying. The path, such as it was, switched back down the cliff face on ledges that seemed barely wide enough for a horse's hooves. Loose stones scattered into the void below, their echoing clatter a constant reminder of how far they would fall if Dusty made a single misstep. But the horse moved with sure-footed determination, navigating obstacles and choosing routes with the precision of long experience. Halfway down the cliff, they paused on a wider ledge, while Dusty evaluated the next section of the descent. From this vantage point, Amos could see their pursuers reaching the top of the mesa. The men were spreading out, clearly searching for signs of where he and Dusty had gone. It would take them time to find the hidden trail, but not much time. And once they did, the descent would be much easier for men on foot than for a horse and rider. As they resumed the dangerous climb down, Amos found himself thinking about Captain Thornfield's final journey. The wounded cavalry officer had made this same descent, probably at night and under fire, carrying evidence that could have exposed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. He had successfully hidden the treasure and documents, but he had paid for that success with his life. Now, nearly 150 years later, the same conspiracy seemed to be reaching out to claim what Thornfield had died, protecting. The federal agents, if that's what they really were, had appeared too quickly and with too much knowledge to be legitimate researchers. Someone had been watching, waiting for the treasure to be discovered, and now they were moving to claim it. The final section of the descent brought them to the floor of a narrow canyon that Amos had never explored before. The walls rose high on both sides, creating a natural corridor that was invisible from the mesa above. Water had carved this passage over millennia, creating smooth stone surfaces and deep pools that reflected the sky like mirrors. Dusty moved confidently through the canyon, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail. But as they progressed deeper into the passage, Amos began to notice something disturbing. Scattered among the rocks were human bones, bleached white by decades of exposure. These weren't ancient remains, they were too well preserved, too modern in their configuration. The horse paused beside one particular collection of bones, and Amos dismounted for a closer look. The remains included fragments of what had once been military-style clothing, along with personal items that suggested a violent death. A tarnished watch, a broken compass, and most tellingly, a brass button identical to those he had found on his property. This was where Captain Thornfield had made his final stand. Wounded and exhausted, he had reached the end of his flight in this hidden canyon. The bones told the story of his last moments, a solitary figure defending himself against overwhelming odds, buying time for Dusty to escape and carry forward the knowledge of where the treasure was hidden. But the horse hadn't escaped permanently. He had returned again and again over the decades, waiting for someone who could understand what he was trying to communicate. The other horses at the auction, the neglect and abuse he had endured, all of it was part of a long journey that had finally led him back to Amos and to this moment of reckoning. The sound of voices echoing from the canyon walls interrupted Amos's revelations. Their pursuers had found the trail and were beginning the descent. The voices were closer than he had expected, suggesting that some of the men had rappelling equipment and were making faster progress down the cliff face. Dusty immediately began moving again, following the canyon as it curved toward the west. The passage was growing narrower, and Amos could see daylight ahead, where it opened onto a wider valley. But the horse's urgency suggested that simply reaching the valley wouldn't be enough. They needed to reach something specific, some destination that would provide safety or at least a strategic advantage. As they emerged from the canyon, Amos found himself looking across a landscape he had never seen before, despite having lived in this area his entire life. The valley was broad and green, fed by springs that created a small creek running through its center. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade and shelter, and the grass was thick and rich. It was the kind of hidden paradise that early settlers had dreamed of finding, a place where a man could build a life far from the troubles of the outside world. But it was also clearly inhabited. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be a well-concealed cabin, and as they approached, Amos could see gardens and corrals that indicated a permanent settlement. Someone was living in this hidden valley, someone who had managed to remain invisible to the outside world for reasons that were probably similar to his own current situation. Dusty moved toward the cabin with obvious familiarity, nickering softly as if announcing their arrival. The door opened, and a figure emerged that made Amos question his sanity once again. The man was elderly, probably in his 80s, but he carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of a career military officer. His hair was white, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He wore simple ranch clothes, but there was something about his bearing that suggested this was no ordinary hermit. "I've been expecting you," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Daniel Thornfield. I believe you've been traveling with an old friend of mine." The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. This was Captain Thornfield's descendant, possibly his son, and he had been living in this hidden valley, protecting the family secrets and waiting for the day when the treasure would finally be discovered. The federal agents, the university researchers, the entire conspiracy, it all suddenly made sense, but there was no time for explanations. The sound of pursuit was getting closer, and the final confrontation was about to begin. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the lost treasure, but the lives of everyone who had become entangled in its deadly legacy. Daniel Thornfield moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Without waiting for explanations or introductions, he began issuing instructions with military precision. "Get your horse into the corral behind the cabin," he said, already moving toward what appeared to be a carefully concealed weapons cache. "They'll be here in minutes, and we need to be ready." Amos dismounted and led Dusty toward the indicated corral, his mind reeling from the rapid succession of revelations. The hidden valley, the elderly man who claimed to be Thornfield's descendant, the approaching danger, it all felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. As he settled Dusty into the corral, Amos noticed that the horse's agitation had calmed considerably. The animal seemed to recognize this place, moving with the comfort of someone returning to familiar territory after a long absence. The corral itself was old but well maintained, and there were clear signs that horses had been kept here regularly. "He remembers, doesn't he?" Daniel called out, emerging from the cabin with an armload of rifles and ammunition. "Dusty spent nearly 2 years here with me after my father's death. I was just a boy then, but I understood that the horse was special, that he carried memories that needed to be preserved." The casual confirmation of what Amos had suspected hit him like a physical blow. Dusty really was the same horse that had carried Captain Thornfield through his final mission. The animal had somehow lived for nearly 150 years, carrying the secret of the hidden treasure and waiting for the right moment to reveal it. "How is that possible?" Amos asked, accepting one of the rifles Daniel handed him. "I've had decades to wonder about that myself," Daniel replied, checking the action on his weapon with practiced ease. "My father wrote about it in his journals, how Dusty seemed to understand things that no normal horse should understand, how he lived far longer than any animal had a right to. The old Cheyenne had stories about spirit horses, animals that carried the souls of warriors and could live as long as their mission remained unfulfilled." The sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. Daniel moved to a window and peered through carefully concealed gun slits. 6 men, well-armed, moving in tactical formation. These aren't federal agents or university researchers. These are professionals. Amos positioned himself at another window, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the rifle. He had been in combat before, during his service in Vietnam, But that had been more than 40 years ago. The skills were still there, buried under decades of peaceful ranch life, but he wasn't sure how quickly he could access them under pressure. "Who are they?" he asked, studying the approaching riders through his sight. "Descendants of the same corrupt officials who killed my father," Daniel replied grimly. "The conspiracy didn't die with the territorial government. It evolved, adapted, found new ways to profit from the resources that my father died trying to protect. They've been watching for any sign that the treasure might be discovered, and when it was, they moved to claim it." The lead rider had dismounted and was approaching the cabin on foot, his rifle held in a ready position. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the kind of hard face that suggested a career built on violence. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the valley. "Mr. Rourke, we know you're in there. We also know you've found something that doesn't belong to you. Come out now, with whatever you took from the mesa, and nobody has to get hurt." Daniel's response was to work the action on his rifle, the metallic sound echoing loudly in the quiet cabin. "My father tried negotiating with men like these," he said quietly. "It didn't work out well for him." The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. The attackers had expected to face an elderly rancher who would surrender without a fight. Instead, they found themselves pinned down by accurate rifle fire from two men who knew both the terrain and the stakes involved. Amos discovered that his old military training was still accessible when needed. The muscle memory of combat shooting came back quickly, and his first shot took the lead attacker's hat off, a clear warning that escalation would be costly. Daniel's shooting was even more precise, disabling two horses and forcing their riders to seek cover behind rocks and trees. The siege continued for nearly an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The attackers had superior numbers and equipment, but the defenders had better position and motivation. More importantly, they had Dusty. The horse had been watching the battle from the corral with obvious intelligence and growing agitation. As the afternoon wore on and the attackers began to probe for weaknesses in the cabin's defenses, Dusty began doing something that defied rational explanation. The horse started moving around the corral in a specific pattern, creating what looked like signals or messages in the dust with his hooves. At first, Amos dismissed it as nervous behavior, but Daniel was paying attention. "He's trying to tell us something," the old man said, studying Dusty's movements carefully. "My father wrote about this, how Dusty could communicate tactical information, almost like he had been trained for military reconnaissance." As if responding to Daniel's recognition, Dusty moved to the edge of the corral closest to the cabin and began pawing at the ground in a pattern that resembled a map. The message was becoming clear. There was another way out of the valley, a hidden route that the attackers hadn't discovered. The escape route that Dusty indicated led through what appeared to be solid rock at the back of the valley. But as Daniel and Amos approached the cliff face during a lull in the shooting, they discovered a narrow cleft concealed by carefully positioned boulders. The opening was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, and it was wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through single file. "My father's final gift," Daniel murmured, running his hands over stones that had clearly been moved by human effort rather than natural forces. He spent his last weeks preparing this escape route, just in case someone ever came looking for what he had hidden. The plan they developed was desperate but feasible. Daniel would remain at the cabin, maintaining suppressing fire to keep the attackers pinned down and unaware that their quarry was escaping. Amos would take Dusty and the precious documents through the hidden passage, following the route to wherever it led. Once he was safely away, Daniel would attempt his own escape, using the superior knowledge of local terrain that came from a lifetime of living in the hidden valley. "Where does the passage lead?" Amos asked, loading the saddlebags with the most critical documents and several pouches of gold coins. "I've never followed it all the way," Daniel admitted, "but my father's journal mentions that it connects to the old railroad grade, about 5 miles from here." If you can reach that, you'll be able to get back to civilization and decide what to do with what you found. The sound of renewed gunfire interrupted their planning. The attackers were probing the cabin's defenses again, testing for weaknesses or signs that their quarry might be running low on ammunition. Daniel moved back to his shooting position, while Amos led Dusty toward the concealed passage. The horse entered the narrow cleft without hesitation, as if he had been through it many times before. The passage was dark and confining, barely wide enough for Dusty's shoulders, but it led steadily upward through the rock. Amos had to duck low in the saddle to avoid overhanging stones, and more than once he wondered if they would become trapped if the passage narrowed further. But after what felt like hours of claustrophobic travel, they emerged onto a high plateau that offered commanding views of the surrounding country. Amos could see the hidden valley behind them, where gunfire still echoed from the ongoing siege. To the east, he could make out the railroad grade that Daniel had mentioned, a straight line cut through the mountainous terrain by 19th-century engineering. Dusty moved across the plateau with confidence, following what appeared to be another ancient trail. The horse seemed to know exactly where he was going, and Amos found himself trusting that knowledge completely. Whatever Dusty's true nature, supernatural, legendary, or simply impossibly long-lived, his understanding of this landscape was perfect. The descent to the railroad grade was less treacherous than their earlier escape from the mesa, but it was still challenging terrain that required careful navigation. As they rode, Amos found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion at a livestock auction. In trying to save an old horse from slaughter, he had uncovered one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American West and become entangled in a conspiracy that reached across nearly 150 years of history. The documents in his saddlebags contained evidence that could expose corruption and murder, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. The gold, while valuable, was secondary to the historical significance of Captain Thornfield's final testimony. But more importantly, both the treasure and the evidence represented justice, long delayed the chance to finally hold accountable those who had profited from the captain's murder. When they reached the old railroad grade, Amos paused to look back toward the hidden valley. The sound of gunfire had stopped, and he could only hope that Daniel had managed his own escape successfully. The old man had risked everything to help a stranger, motivated by loyalty to his father's memory and a desire to see justice finally served. Dusty began moving along the railroad grade with renewed energy, as if sensing that their destination was near. The abandoned railway had been built during the mining boom of the 1880s, designed to carry precious metals from the mountain camps to the outside world. Now it was slowly being reclaimed by nature, but the roadbed still provided an excellent route through terrain that would otherwise be impassable. As they traveled, Amos began to formulate a plan for what to do with the treasure and documents he carried. Simply turning everything over to federal authorities seemed naive, given that some of those authorities might be connected to the same interests that had killed Captain Thornfield. But keeping the treasure for himself felt wrong, both morally and practically. He was neither equipped nor inclined to spend his remaining years looking over his shoulder for treasure hunters and criminals. The answer, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. Eleanor Whitman at the library had the expertise to authenticate the documents and the connections to ensure they reached legitimate historians and researchers. The treasure itself could be donated to establish a historical foundation, ensuring that Captain Thornfield's story was finally told and that future research into territorial corruption would be properly funded. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Amos of the treasure he carried, he and Dusty finally reached the point where the old railroad grade intersected with a modern county road. The sight of asphalt and power lines was jarring after their journey through landscapes that had remained unchanged since the 19th century. A few hours later, they arrived back at the Broken R Ranch. The familiar buildings looked different somehow, touched by the knowledge of all that had happened since they had left that morning. Amos unsaddled Dusty and turned him into the corral, watching as the horse rolled contentedly in the dust, looking once again like nothing more than an elderly animal enjoying a simple pleasure. But as Amos walked toward the house, carrying the saddlebags that contained treasures worth millions of dollars and documents that could rewrite frontier history, he knew that his life had been transformed forever. The struggling rancher who had bought an old horse out of pity was gone, replaced by the keeper of secrets that had waited nearly 150 years to be revealed. 6 months later, Amos sat on his porch in the early morning light, reading the front page of the Denver Post with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. The headline read, "Lost Treasure Reveals 19th Century Conspiracy. Documents expose territorial corruption." Below, it was a photograph of Eleanor Whitman standing beside a display case containing some of the artifacts they had discovered, her face beaming with the joy of a historian whose greatest dreams had come true. The story had captured national attention, not just for the treasure itself, but for the remarkable tale of how it had been discovered. The press had been fascinated by the account of an elderly rancher and his mysterious horse, uncovering evidence that had eluded researchers for nearly 150 years. Several television producers had already approached Amos about telling the story, but he had politely declined all offers. Some stories, he felt, were too important to be turned into entertainment. The establishment of the Thornfield Foundation had proceeded smoothly, with the recovered gold providing initial funding for research into territorial period corruption and Native American land rights. The Foundation's first major project was a comprehensive study of fraudulent treaties and land deals throughout the American West, work that was already revealing patterns of exploitation that had been hidden for generations. Daniel Thornfield had survived the confrontation at the Hidden Valley, escaping through yet another secret route that his father had prepared decades earlier. He had emerged 3 days later at a small town 50 miles away, where he contacted federal authorities who were legitimate, not the impersonators who had been pursuing the treasure. The subsequent investigation had led to arrests and indictments, though Amos suspected that some of the conspiracy's modern beneficiaries had managed to escape justice by covering their tracks more carefully than their predecessors. The physical transformation of the Broken R Ranch was remarkable but not ostentatious. The leaked roof had been repaired, the fencing replaced, and the small herd expanded to a size that made the operation financially viable again. But Amos had been careful not to make changes that would attract unwanted attention or speculation about sudden wealth. To casual observers, he was simply a rancher who had experienced a modest improvement in his circumstances. The most significant change was harder to quantify, but impossible to miss. Amos carried himself with renewed purpose, the bearing of a man who had discovered that his best days were not behind him, but had been waiting to be claimed. The isolation and decline that had characterized his life since Martha's death had been replaced by engagement with the wider world and a sense that he still had important contributions to make. Dusty grazed peacefully in the pasture beyond the corral, looking every bit the contented elderly horse that he appeared to be. Visitors often asked about him, particularly after the story of their partnership had become public knowledge. Amos always smiled and spoke of the remarkable intelligence and intuition that some horses possessed, never revealing the full truth of what he suspected about his companion's true nature and impossible longevity. The horse had earned his rest, Amos felt. Whatever supernatural forces or ancient mysteries had kept Dusty alive for nearly 150 years, whatever mission had driven him to preserve the memory of Captain Thornfield's sacrifice, it had finally been fulfilled. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served as much as was possible after so many years, and the treasure had been used to honor the memory of those who had died protecting it. On quiet evenings, Amos sometimes sat by the corral fence and spoke to Dusty about their adventures, sharing his thoughts about the strange turns that life could take and the unexpected ways that kindness could be rewarded. The horse would often approach the fence during these conversations, as if listening and understanding every word. Whether Dusty truly comprehended human speech, whether he possessed memories that spanned centuries, or whether he was simply a very intelligent animal with an unusual gift for reading human emotions, Amos would never know for certain. But he was grateful every day for the decision to spend his last $50 on a horse that others had considered worthless. The story of Captain Marcus Thornfield and his loyal mount had become legend, inspiring books and documentaries and academic research that would continue for years to come. But for Amos Rourke, the real treasure had been simpler and more profound than gold or historical significance. It had been the discovery that compassion could lead to adventure, that kindness could be rewarded in ways beyond imagination, and that sometimes the most important journeys began with the smallest acts of human decency. As he finished his coffee and prepared to begin another day on the Broken Arrow Ranch, Amos reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning at the livestock auction. The struggling rancher who had feared losing his land was now the custodian of one of the most significant historical discoveries of the modern era. The lonely widower who had faced an uncertain future was now connected to researchers and historians around the world, all working together to uncover and preserve the truth about America's frontier past. But most importantly, the man who had thought his best days were behind him had learned that life could surprise you at any age, that purpose and adventure could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes salvation came in forms you would never think to expect, like a worn-out horse with secrets that had been waiting nearly 150 years to be shared with someone wise enough to listen. The sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, painting the ranch in golden light that reminded Amos of treasure and legend and the enduring power of stories that deserved to be told. In the distance, Dusty raised his head from grazing and looked toward the house, as if sensing his owner's reflective mood and offering silent companionship across the years they had shared together. It had been, Amos thought with deep satisfaction, a very good investment indeed.